was 2012, February. I remember it like yesterday. I was having a beer with a friend of mine who worked for another bank. And he was like, hey man, have you heard of this thing called Bitcoin? I was like, what the fuck is that? So I went home that night. I Googled it. The only thing that came up at the time was a white paper. I read it. I couldn't sleep that night. I literally could not sleep.
David Shin,
a leader at Immutable X.
He's actively shaping digital asset policies and advising central banks.
You went as far as saying that gaming is the future of Web3. Why?
We're training ourselves to be a lot more digital in how we operate. And at this moment in time, we're still very two-dimensional in how we operate on the internet. I think at some point, we're going to see the interaction between applications and human beings evolve. I would imagine that it's going to be more like a Ready Player One environment where we're so submersed into a particular app that impacts our day-to-day life.
And you think gaming helps get there?
Gaming is one of the most immersive ways of interacting with the digital at this stage.
If you choose to join Immutable X,
Immutable has the right tech, they have the right business model, and they have the right people. I think if anyone's going to lead gaming, it's going to be Immutable because that's all they do. They don't do DeFi. They don't look at things like SocialFi. They only look at gaming.
what's attracted you so much in Africa? What's the opportunity there?
Everything I just told you, if it all happens, the biggest benefactor will be the continent of Africa. And the reason for that is because...
So, Dave, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here.
Can you tell the people before we dive deeper into quite a few topics I want to cover today? Can you tell people who you are?
Yeah. Let's see, where do I begin? So my name is Dave or David Shin, Canadian, who's been living in Asia for just over 20 years. I have been in investment banking for about 17, 18 years. 2012, I found Bitcoin, and I was one of the first ASIC miners. Or tried to be. The challenge back then was a lot of these ASIC chips were pre-funded and they couldn't deliver, but yet they took payment up front. And so for me, that payment was in Bitcoin, and it was very difficult to get back in the civil courts in the US, but that's how I started. And then around 2013, I got involved with Ripple. I was actually, it's a good time to be very frank about my career in crypto. I was actually probably the first banker to be very open about Bitcoin and then talking about blockchain and how it can affect SWIFT and cross-border payments. So that caught the attention of Ripple. I went out there and spent some time with Chris Larsen and his team to talk to them about why they should pivot from what they were doing at the time. At the time, they were incentivizing engineers with XRP to build what they call XRP gateways. And there's a guy named Ryan Terabellini who is heading that whole piece for them, who he and I became very good friends. We're still good friends. He's now at Algorand Foundation. But I kind of went in there to San Francisco in 2013 and said, Chris and team, you should be using Ripple infrastructure to disrupt SWIFT, because SWIFT is very centralized. And what they do is they prioritize the banks that they want to allow to go through the network, and then deprioritize the banks that they don't. So the challenge at the time was there's a lot of regional banks that were building up strong balance sheets. This was post 2008, when everyone was talking about a lot of cash being in Asia. That cash was sitting in regional banks, whether it was DBS, OCBC, or Korean banks or Japanese banks, and a lot of these banks, including the ones in Southeast Asia, Maybank and whatnot, they were not really given as much capacity over the SWIFT network. And I knew this from being in banking. Then the JP Morgans, the Citibanks, these larger global banks.
Why was that the case?
Because these global banks offer, they're the ones that bridge the interbank transfers. So if you're going from, let's say, a local bank, let's call it OCBC, and you're transferring money from here to, let's say, the US to a Citibank, there's usually a global intermediary bank that sits in between those two networks. And that's all SWIFT networks. So they want to prioritize that because that's where the bigger money is, right? And that's why in many cases, we end up paying a lot of money for those cross-border transfers, and they take a long time as well.
The SWIFT network, what is it exactly? Is it a bunch of banks teaming up together?
It's a consortium.
It's a consortium, and then splitting up the fees, or is it an organization on its own, or how does it work?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll be honest with you. I don't think it's a profitable business when it comes to the transferring of payments, because it's a low margin business, but high cost because you have to maintain, a swath of infrastructure, right? Like data centers connecting networks and whatnot. That's not going to be cheap. However, where they do make the margin is not from the transactions that cut through. The banks as a consortium make the money because if they are the owners of SWIFT, because they're the consortium, what they can do is they can lay out the rules of the road. So part of the rules are that if that same use case where I transfer from OCBC to Citibank in the US, from Singapore to US, not only is it expensive in terms of the rules of the road, but they will create latency. So it shouldn't take 3 business days to 5 business days for that money to get to the US. Because in fact, when you open up the hood of the car, it's only debit and credit messages. But the reason why they do this is because they then create pools of funds short term that they can lend to each other. And this is what we call the interbank lending market and how they develop LIBOR. And that's how they make the money.
I have so many questions just regarding that. Maybe because this is so interesting, and is why you could argue that if they offer this, let's take the bank side, right? Because we love crypto and Bitcoin, so we probably don't like banks much, right? But let's take the bank side first. If this SWIFT network is not profitable, they need but it's very useful, right? At least until maybe stable coins and all that stuff. But before, they need a way to make money.
You mean the banks?
Exactly.
Yeah.
For offering this service that's extremely useful for people, because you need to send money from one place to another, right? For people and companies. So it's kind of justified-ish.
Yeah. This goes back to a broader philosophy for me. I believe that first of all, banks make money because they take deposits. And they use those deposits for lending, and they create credit markets off the back of that. And through that, they also fund various different projects through corporate development or corporate finance. So they're using our money that we deposit to make money. The question for me that I've always had working in banks for 17, 18 years is, should a bank be a commercial institution, or should it be like a utility company? Utility companies make money. I mean, you can't argue that an electricity company doesn't make money. It's just, to me, they make money in a way where it adds utility value. Whereas the banks are, I think, taking a lot of risk to make money. And that's why we get into bubbles until it blows up and they get their hand slapped.
So this would, for example, in the banking example, would mean maybe what wealth managers are doing, which is I'll charge you a percentage, like 1%, to manage your assets. So that's kind of like I'm providing you value in that sense, because maybe you are not capable, or maybe you just don't have time to do it, right? And I'm not taking too much risks by creating kind of like debt out of thin air.
Yeah,
right?
I have no problem with Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley making money. I have problems with Deutsche Bank or Citibank or other commercial banks that are creating investment arms and making money. That becomes problematic. Deposit money should never be used. Deposit money should be held in custody with the banks. And yes, there are certain guarantees that are provided through insurance and whatnot, but I think at the end of the day, it's beyond the guarantees. It's about the various secondary markets that they create from trying to be so profitable and to create a culture of, greed and speculation. It culminated with 2008. I lived through it. I was working at Morgan Stanley in Japan when we got hit with the financial crisis. For anyone who was actually in a bank working at the time, going through that real time, it was scary. I mean, think about a whole industry. You're not sure if it's going to exist, in a week's time. So like that kind of risk taking with, a combination of regulators deregulating to try and create, more alpha into the markets it was a bad combination. I think it's only a matter of time when, because everything's cyclical, that it comes back again. But
of course, especially because greed is inherent to basically humans' behavior. There's one thing that never changes is kind of like this greed. I mean, the fear and the greed, right? But the greed side, and even in crypto, we just reproduce the same.
Yeah, and I think greed levels have increased more because of corporate appetite. Like everything's about earnings. Like same with the banks, right? Like it's all about earnings. It's about earnings for LVMH. It's about earnings for McDonald's. So they're going to do everything to cost save and push out their product as much as possible. And sometimes it's almost borderline inhumane in terms of how they create certain campaigns and certain, like you look at the whole argument about fashion, right? Like how many times have we seen in the media that it's not healthy to be rack thin, for girls to be, just to look as pretty as they can, be very thin. It's very well documented. That's not a healthy thing, but it's, they talk about it probably for about a year and then it just goes back to what it was. Like, I don't see any changes in the fashion industry, quite frankly. Any big changes.
So if profit is not the right incentive, what is the right incentive? Because you can argue that in the banking world, but you can also argue that, I mean, you said fashion, but I can also tell you, look, if I walk in a convenience store or if I just go in a grocery store, most of the food is shit.
Yeah.
And so 95% of the food no one should even eat.
Mm-hmm.
But because of probably profit reasons, all this stuff is there. It needs to be able to not perish and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, we live in a capitalistic world. And if profit is not the main incentive, what is? Or what should it be?
Yeah, I think if I were to be king for the day and re-engineer the whole thing, I'm not 100% believer of social credit, but I'm a 50% believer. So what I mean by that, let me explain. I think if I had to redraw the whole economic incentive model of the world, what I would do is create a market where people are incentivized to do good. And the more good that they do, it's like building up your credit worthiness.
Mm.
And as that social credit gets built, that enables you to access more than someone who hasn't contributed as much, and therefore their social credit is much lower. That way, you're incentive aligned, right? You want more in terms of the material goods, then you've got to contribute more.
To the greater good.
Yeah.
Every week, I sit down with the biggest builders, investors, and traders in the crypto industry for a 2-hour-long conversation on my podcast, When Shift Happens. I had most of the biggest people in the crypto space in this studio. Arthur Hayes, Jordi Alexander, Ben Zhao from Bybit, Miao from Jupiter, Luke Belmar. This, in turns, allows me to get the best alpha and private deals directly from the big builders before anyone else. Today, I'm announcing that I've teamed up with SwissBorg, the largest European exchange, to bring you the best alpha deals directly from the best builders and investors in the crypto space. We're doing this through an exclusive investment club called the Kevin SwissBorg Investment Club, which is accessible only via the SwissBorg app. What can you expect in the Kevin SwissBorg Investment Club? Exclusive access to only the best alpha from the best builders in the space before anyone else, and exclusive private deals that are filtered by the SwissBorg investment team and that are sourced directly from my behind the doors conversations with the crypto kings and queens. I have to say, this is not about random projects to buy or trade every day, but rather to focus on a few key projects, airdrops, and deals that can really move the needle and help you master the crypto game over the next 5 years, not 5 weeks. If getting the best alpha from the biggest builders in the space before anyone else and accessing some of the best private deals in the space sounds like something that would add great value to your investment journey, you can check the first link in the description down below. And now back to today's episode.
You can actually do this through crypto. You know, it's something I talked about. I even wrote about it in my book. If you think about decentralizing something like that, you know, what you could do today is, you know, take the concept of like a red, amber, and green token. And those tokens really have no monetary value, but what they have is social value. And you define it that way in your ecosystem. And so a wallet, which you don't have to really KYC, but the public address is good enough, people can see that you are contributing, funding, giving away, you know, building on open source, like doing stuff where it creates an audit trail, and people then give you green tokens. And that green token represents good. If someone's doing bad, like, you know, a wallet is a wallet in terms of not just transactional wallet for crypto, but a wallet as in like a single sign-on, right? Your single point of identification. And again, you know, we can argue about KYC versus just the public address, but people will generally know that wallet, right? And that wallet then doing things bad or what people deem to be bad gets red tokens. So at the end of the day, people can see in your wallet how many reds, how many greens. And if people are wanting to warn you because you may have done something by mistake, or they want to give you a chance and you get yellows. So it's almost like football.
So that's almost an argument for central bank digital currencies. CBDCs where it's very government controlled, right? Because it would enable the government to basically see exactly who is spending on what, and incentivizing people in different
That's very centralized. What I'm proposing is like, you know, when you have community programs where everyone in the neighborhood's just watching out for each other, right? And they're policing their own neighborhood. That's what I'm talking about. I think this is the best way to decentralize yet monitor behavior is to create this sort of social credit structure with tokens and have individual people who are a part of that ecosystem be able to determine how they value the behavior of that wallet or person. You can't get more decentralized than that.
Do you think it's possible to get to that?
I think it could be. It's just, you know, a lot of people have to accept that that's gonna be what they want. The problem is in this world today, what we present ourselves to be, like who we are, is actually, I would say, a very small fraction is very genuine. Majority of the world, they actually have ulterior, you know, motives. They have different ways of doing things, you know, so it's not going to work in that regard.
And also, most of the people are followers.
Most of the people are followers.
They're followers, and they need these kind of like cult figures or CEOs or idols. They need someone to follow. And if you look at just the normal world, you have companies with founders or CEOs. And I think, you know, maybe as entrepreneurs, we're like, oh man, I mean, especially when you're a young entrepreneur, you don't understand why someone would want to be an employee. At some point, you start to understand the dynamics, which is some people are just different, right? And it's really good that there is people who kind of follow more and some people who lead more, because if everybody was kind of a leader, it probably would be more difficult.
Well,
So-
it's actually, you can even do it today on Instagram or Facebook. It's just replacing the likes, right? I mean, really what creates influencers? It's the followers and the likes,
Mhm.
right? So kind of you can think of the red as a dislike and the green as a like, and then, a yellow as a sideway thumb, right? That allows you to quantify to a certain degree the value, social value of that particular person on Instagram.
Why do you think that, I mean, Instagram or Facebook or most of these platforms, they went from like to like and upload and love and all this stuff, but only positive kind of icons, right?
Yeah.
Why do you think there is not a better representation of
You can't
kind of-
you can't monetize off hate without getting called out for it, right? Like, I think it's just the world that we live in. Everything has to be flowing in a certain direction for people to make money, especially those who are creating these platforms, right?
Absolutely. That's the world we live in. And the world we live in has some other kind of dynamics that you don't really like. We talked about the other day, the fact that millennials and Gen Z, you don't really like the way that they think. They don't have religion. They don't have spirituality. Why is religion, spirituality, or any form of greater force with guiding principles so necessary for our species to survive or even thrive?
Human beings are innately born, in my opinion, of a certain direction. And without laws or guidance or principles, whether it's taught from your parents or handed down from generation to generation, we're actually pretty lost. So when you think about laws, societal laws that have been passed down, centuries after centuries, you can map it back to Moses, right? Regardless of whether you're a Christian, Catholic, Jew, or Muslim, the one thing that those four large, I mean, that probably makes up like 70, 80% of the world, right? The one thing that can't be disputed is the Old Testament of the Bible. They all believe it and they will never dispute it.
Mm.
Okay. So we have to assume there's some truth to that when 80% of the world is following it. I mean, so having said that, when you look at the Old Testament, the way that humanity actually started really evolving was after the 10 Commandments. Because people started, I mean, throughout the whole Old Testament of the Bible, it's always about God.
Mm.
And, trying to understand and live by God's standards. And now God has given human beings 10 commandments. So using that analogy, I think as humans, as we evolve in the 21st century, we still need standards and principles that are fundamentally guiding us. So in our previous discussion, it was really analogies around spirituality, like having a spiritual compass, or being principled in other ways. It could be through academics. I think the point I was trying to make there is that at the end of the day, the generation that I'm seeing on the internet is losing and foregoing and forgetting about fundamental principles of being human.
What's the risk?
Well, if it doesn't go regulated, which is why I'm such a big proponent of eventually thinking about some sort of social credit system. If it doesn't go regulated, I think we're going to have a lot of very toxic. I mean, it's already toxic, quite frankly. I mean, let's admit it.
Yeah.
It's pretty bad. And we may not even be seeing half the data. I'm sure there's a lot more suicides, right? It's probably just not tracked in terms of it was a suicide related to social bullying or, related to the internet. But I would imagine that those numbers would probably rise at some point.
I mean, there's definitely a big rise. I mean, a big rise in depression and mental health issues. And yes, the fact that we're online and all this kind of new way to live is probably a reason, but maybe if you go look at a more core reason, it may be just like a disconnection to main values or having no values at all, right?
Or, coming up with new values that are moving away from standards that really tie
absolutely.
back to the core principle.
You've got kids.
2 of them, yeah.
What are the key values you want your kids to grow up with?
Good question. I want my kids to be rational and logical when they look at the world, which means that you take a balanced approach when you make decisions. So don't just watch Fox News without watching CNN. Don't read Washington Post without reading, the RTS, right? Like, I think you just need balance in this world of information because there's a lack of regulation, which we talked about over the internet, that people can write anything without context, and it's very hard to tell. So the only way to do it is you have to self-regulate what you're reading and make a 360-degree view of the world in that way and make decisions that way.
Yeah, and if you add I would argue this is almost kind of like the old world, which is like kind of now and a few years ago, but like with the new word AI, it's not even anymore like, hey, look at both sides, but look at whether the piece of information that you're reading or looking at is even true, which is going to happen more and more.
It's going to take catfishing to another level if you think about it. Like it literally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember. The other day I was listening to someone, I think it was Raoul Pal. He was saying that the 2024 US election,
Yeah.
just because of AI and a lot of kind of fake, wrong information being built by this AI, he was saying, watch how much arguments you're going to have with your family members
Yep.
and your neighbors
100%.
and everyone,
Yeah.
just because of all this fake info that is not even written by humans anymore, but by AI. And it's going to happen this year, not in 5 years, right?
Goes back to what I would teach my kids. Take a balanced view of the world. A lot of people don't. They read something because they trust something, but, that's not the right decision. Like, I wouldn't trust CNN, that's for sure. I wouldn't trust Fox. Maybe you read both and then you figure out rationally what should be in between.
So you have kids, but you were also a kid one day.
I was a kid once. Yeah.
Once upon a time
Long
in
time
Canada.
ago. In Canada, that's right.
How was your childhood like? Especially as an Asian kid in Canada.
Yeah. And, this was a long time ago because I'm turning 49 this year. So I grew up in the, I was born in 1975. So I primarily grew up in the 80s and 90s. Let's just say it like that. It was, especially in the 80s, there wasn't that much immigration in Canada at the time yet with Asians. So I grew up in a very, white Anglo-Saxon Jewish part of Toronto. My first sport at the age of 6 was ice hockey, right? I mean, not many Asians grew up playing ice hockey, right? From the age of 6. So it was very different. By the time I was in high school, I was going to a lot of bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, junior high. That was my essentially growing up period. I was struggling to find an identity of who I was, being born and raised in Canada at that time. Again, you're not surrounded by people that look like you, so you're trying to figure out who am I. But that created a pocket of exploration for me in terms of trying to figure out who I was, which when I look back on it now and I write about this in my book, I would never take that back. So I dropped out of high school for a year to follow the Grateful Dead. And there was...
What does that mean?
That means I think I caught 5 shows across 5 different cities, 1 city in Canada and then 4 in the US. I basically hopped in a van with 2 of my friends. We were I mean, I was 15, one guy was 16, he was the driver, and then the other guy was turning 16. We were very young. We just got in. We decided that we were going to go to one concert that was in Hamilton in Canada.
Mm.
We loved it so much. We were like, okay, you know what? Let's just quit school and go spend some time watching the Grateful Dead. So we did that.
How did you justify that to your parents?
I just left.
You left home.
Yeah, I just left.
So then you're basically you take care of yourself, so they kind of have nothing to say, right?
Yeah, I took care of myself. I mean, the reason why I did this was when I look back on this now, my father passed away when I was 12.
Mm.
It's for a guy like from basically 13 onwards, it's a pretty critical period, right? You're going through adolescence and you're trying to figure out who you are. I also had identity sort of questions about myself, being an Asian guy, growing up with a bunch of white people. It was just one of those things where it culminated to, I can't be at home and I have to it's almost like the prodigal son, right? Like I need to go find out who I am and just figure it all out. So I left, dropped out for a year, and it was, but again, it was the greatest experience. I'd do it again.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a short moment to introduce our partner, Mantle, who helps us make this show possible. Mantle was created to hyperscale the Ethereum network with what we call a layer 2 that helps users like you and me transact much faster and at a fraction of the cost of the Ethereum network. Mantle has over $2 billion in total value locked, has a mega treasury of $3.7 billion in Bitcoin, ETH, and stablecoins, and has the largest eco fund of the industry with more than $200 million to invest into new projects that want to join the Mantle ecosystem. The team behind Mantle are extremely smart people who I personally trust with some of my money and who I personally know outside of crypto. We actually had Ignace Ternus and Jordi Alexander on this podcast, who both are key figures in the Mantle ecosystem. So I invite you to watch these two very candid and in-depth conversations to develop your own opinion. And please, 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 if you enjoy this show, hit the like button, leave a comment in the comment section, and subscribe to this channel. The more subscribers, the better the guests. Thank you so much for your help. And now on to today's episode.
So you had your experience, but then at some point you realized, I'll get back to normal life, like real life, which for you was, probably continuing your studies and then starting to work.
Yeah.
Did you go to investment bank directly?
So my story is, I went to a school called Waterloo, which just as a footnote, I didn't want to go there. I mean, at the time, the ongoing joke was people were calling it the University of Wang and Wu. Because I kid you not, because it's a very engineering, math, computer science school. And so like, that's not the kind of friends and groups that I really hung around with at the time, but it was really more a decision that my family was making for me.
Based on your skills or based on the reputation it would give you if you get out of that?
Correct. Yeah, the latter, right? So I kind of had no choice. I had a choice, but really not, if I'm honest. And the deal that I swung with my mother was, look, I'll go because you want me to, but if it doesn't work out, I'm transferring out. So that was kind of the deal. I went, and it is true. Mothers always know what's best. So I went, and initially it was hard to integrate because it was almost like I went through reverse cultural shock in a sense that I was an Asian guy who grew up with a lot of like Jewish and white friends playing ice hockey, as I mentioned. And I go to university, like high school as well. It was all sort of, that's why we were hippies. We went to Grateful Dead concerts. And then I go to university where literally the white guy was me because the rest of them are all Asians, if you know what I mean, right?
And super nerds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just, it was such a mind-blowing experience. Like, what the fuck? And so I was like, I remember the first month, it was September, I was calling my mom going, you better, I know I told you I'm going to wait 1 year, but I swear to God, I'm going to transfer immediately when we hit June. And she's like, give it a shot. So I went through, and she was right. It was a great school. And it was a great school because when you start, university is the great equalizer. Okay. It's the great equalizer because you could come from poverty, but if you're smart enough, you can get there. You can come from the most politically powerful family, but you get there. You all get there. And then it's a matter of what you do with it. Right. And that's what I realized was there are some fucking smart people in Waterloo. Actually, one of the guys, classmates of mine was Shamath, the guy who founded social...
Capital.
Yeah.
He was in your...
Yeah. I used to compete with him. I mean, I have a tweet where I tweeted out to him like, hey, do you remember me? He's like, yeah, we used to compete for jobs.
He's the reason why I bought my first Bitcoin. Chamath.
Exactly. He's a Waterloo guy. So was his ex-wife.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, I mean, you start realizing it doesn't matter if you're fucking yellow, white, black, like intelligence is what really motivates, right? And so, yeah, it was a good ride going out to Waterloo for school.
What happened afterwards?
So Waterloo is the only school in Canada. They have this thing called co-op program. It's like an internship. So your undergrad degree, which is normally 4 years everywhere else in the world, it ends up being 5. Because what they do is every 4 months, you're either in school or you're working on a co-op work term. And so this is also the attractive thing for most students to want to come into Waterloo. So I spent a lot of my work terms at the banks on their trading floors, which is why I came across Shamath because he and I would compete for these trading floor jobs. There weren't that many for students. Man, I could tell you, like, if you think trading floors are rough these days, like it's nothing compared to what it was back in the 90s, right? Like they were still allowed to smoke on the trading floor. Compliance didn't even exist back then. So the number of times like I got called things that, I probably shouldn't have been, or put under duress. Like, the one story I tell people all the time is if I hire interns, and I have in several of my other jobs, I would never go make them get me breakfast because I have nightmares about that. When I was a co-op intern,
I wanted to ask an example of a story that happened.
Yeah, when I was working at Citibank on their trading floor in Canada, okay, I was basically running the cash desk. Now, that sounds like preposterous. How could a co-op student be running their cash desk? I literally was. Like I was funding the Canadian bond desk and I was funding the US bond desk. And I would write up the cash tickets. Of course, I needed to get approval from my desk head, Richard, at the time. But I'd be forced to do all the cash calculations, what that cost would be like. And back then there was no, literally there was no spreadsheets. I had to do everything by hand, timestamp it. There were 3 sheets, one for the front office, one for the middle office, and one for the back office. And they would reconcile it through those 3 sheets. So you make one mistake and honest to God, you're going to get bullets hitting your head from the traders, and they're nasty. So you can imagine, I'm just setting the picture for what the stage was like. Every morning I would come in and of course, being the intern or co-op student, I'd be asked to go get the breakfast, right? And if they wanted to be mean about it, it wasn't just for my desk. Oh, hey, Joey, do you want something as well for your guys? Okay. And then I would have to get all the bagels and coffee for them. So by the end of it, on a bad day, I would have to get bagels and coffee for 10 people. Not only that, here's where the duress kicks in. They would tell me, if you don't come back before the market opens, you're paying for it all. I'm like, what the fuck? And you know what? Back then, $35 is a lot of money, man.
Yeah.
Seriously. And I would be waiting in line. Sometimes if it was really heavy snow day in Toronto and the lines were long, I would be almost literally pissing my pants. I can't afford this week. So it was horrible. It was horrible.
But very,
I can laugh about it now,
very formative.
I mean, it toughens you up, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, as you probably know, we are teaming up with Astar Network on this show. Astar Network is a decentralized blockchain platform that aims to bring billions of people into Web3. And the Astar team has a very specific strategy to make this happen, to partner with the biggest conglomerates in Web2 and help them onboard their customers into our world, the Web3 world. If you want to check out for yourself, I invite you to watch the Candid podcast I recorded with Sota Watanabe, the founder of Startail Labs and Astar Network. And please, 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 if you enjoy this show, hit the like button, leave a comment in the comment section, and subscribe to this channel. The more subscribers, the better the guests. Thank you so much for your help. And now on to today's episode. So it was not traumatic enough to make you leave because you spent 17 or 18 years in investment bank, right?
Well, I took a detour. So when I graduated, I had offers to go to several banks, and I said no. I was pretty traumatized, if I'm honest, and I decided that I would do something different. I didn't want to work for a bank anymore. So I actually worked for Canada's biggest insurance company called Manulife Financial. And I ended up taking a job. It was boring as fuck, but I took a job in their IT department. Insurance companies still use mainframes because they require heavy processing during every month end and every year end, right? Insurance policies, they go through something called a monthly process. So every month there's a monthly process, and you have to process a lot of insurance policies, and at the end of the year. So it's heavy processing, and the only thing at the time that could process that much data was mainframe. So mainframes require what they call batch to process. And batch itself required a certain type of computer language to change what to do as a part of the batch processing. It was called JCL, job control language. That my job was literally to write JCL for changes in the batch. It was so fucking boring. I was like, I gotta go back to banks. And that's why I went back to banks.
And you spent 17 years there.
17 years there at the banks, yeah.
And then after these 17 years, is it when you discovered Bitcoin that you left directly, or?
Yeah, I was working for Barclays at the time, based in Hong Kong, and it was 2012, February. I remember it like yesterday. I was having a beer with a friend of mine who worked for another bank, Goldman Sachs, and he said to me, he was like, "Hey man, have you heard of this thing called Bitcoin?" I was like, "What the fuck is that?" And he mentioned it to me because we used to spitball and talk about different technologies that the trading floors were using for executing trades and whatnot, because that was my job. Actually, I was head of product at the time in Barclays Prime Service, developing solutions for the trading desks. So we were talking about that, and that's what he did at Goldman. And then he's like, by the way, have you heard of this thing called Bitcoin? I'm like, no, what the fuck's that? He goes, look, it's hard to explain. Why don't you just go home and Google it? You'll see this thing. A guy named Satoshi wrote something, just read it. It's the coolest shit ever. So I went home that night. I Googled it, came up. The only thing that came up at the time was a white paper. I read it. I couldn't sleep that night. I literally could not sleep. And I fell asleep on my desk. And my wife woke me up. And the next day I went into the office. The first guy I called was a guy named James De Castro, Spanish friend of mine who's... at the time, he was very, very well known in equity derivatives, very smart guy. He was heading Merrill Lynch's equity trading business in Asia. One of the smartest guys I knew. And I said, "Hey, James, look, I've been reading about this thing called Bitcoin. Do you know about it?" He goes, "No, I don't, but my younger brother's doing something with it in Silicon Valley. Why don't you reach out to him? I'll put you in touch." I did. It was him and his partner who ended up creating this ASIC chip company in San Francisco that basically did the pre-fund scam, took a ton of Bitcoin from myself and my partners, and only delivered about 30% of the chips. So that's where we circle back to what I was telling you earlier in the podcast.
So this is not a great experience, obviously, but you told me that now it's been 12 years, right? You met a lot of key people along the way.
I did.
Right? And one of them is Matthew Mellon, who was a good friend of yours.
Yes.
And was a pretty crazy story.
Yeah.
Descendant of the Mellon family, introduced to Bitcoin by the Winklevoss twins, 2012.
Correct. Yeah.
I read, I'm not sure it's correct, but I read that he made a 2 million investment in XRP, in Ripple, that made him like hundreds of millions. And then he passed away in 2018
Yep.
because of an addiction to opioids.
Well,
At least that's what's written online, right?
Yeah.
And he left behind about 500 million worth of XRP token that were lost because no one had access to his private keys. So basically there's a lot of to unpack here.
yeah.
The first thing that I'd like to unpack is probably, you told me you have some amazing stories with Matthew in the early Bitcoin days to share.
Yeah. So I met Matthew again, Barclays in Hong Kong. I had gotten, this is shortly after I sold whatever equipment that we did get delivered. And I decided that I would start looking at Ripple because, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I really saw the value in using blockchain for cross-border payments and to disrupt SWIFT. And I thought Ripple was the prime technology platform to do that with, the prime blockchain for various different reasons. And so I was going down that path, looking at that. I started writing what ended up being a 50-page document, which I used in San Francisco to walk Chris and his team through. I was working on that at the time when the New York Times called me and they said, we'd like to do an interview on you. And the reason why, I actually did quite a few interviews from about 2013 to 2015 while I was in Hong Kong, because a lot of these large financial institutions had heard there was the senior banker guy walking around the streets of Lan Kwai Fong in Hong Kong, in a suit, handing out Bitcoin stickers and trying to get people to accept Bitcoin and use Bitcoin, which is what I was doing. And so New York Times economists, a whole bunch of them interviewed me, but in this particular instance, it was the New York Times. I ended up becoming what I thought would be a small little blurb in the middle of the paper. They ended up putting it on A2. A1 is the front cover of the New York Times. A2 is the back cover, or right behind it. And it was a big spread, the full page with a big picture of me in the middle. Matthew Mellon lived in New York. He's reading this paper, having breakfast, opens up A2 and he sees this Asian guy in Hong Kong talking about Bitcoin. He reads my article. He gets someone to somehow find me online. I think it was through LinkedIn. And he contacts me through LinkedIn. And I remember this like yesterday. I'm on the trading floor in Barclays. A friend of mine who was working in the London trading floor was on business to the Hong Kong office, sitting beside me. I'm like, dude, take a look at this. There's a guy named Matthew Mellon who wants to kind of see me in Hong Kong. Do you think this is bullshit? He goes, it probably is, but it's not going to hurt if you just reply and go, you know what, dude, why don't you come? I'm in Chung Kong Center. I'm at Barclays. You can look me up. I literally said that because I thought it was bullshit. A week later, main reception in the lobby calls me, says there's a Matthew Mellon here to see you. And at the time, Spencer, who was the guy from London, had already gone back, but I sent him a Bloomberg message going, dude, remember the Matthew Mellon guy? He's like, yeah. I'm like, apparently he's here to see me. He goes, go down. You have security everywhere. What's going to happen? So I went down and it was him. That's how it all began. So I'm like, okay, wow, Matthew Mellon, I know who you are. I'm thinking this in my head. I'm going, you probably want to go to a fancy 5-star hotel to have a cup of coffee. He goes to me, there's a nice little Starbucks there. Why don't we go there for coffee? And I was like, okay, I think I'm going to like this guy. Very down to earth. And, over the years that I've gotten to know him, that's exactly who he was. He was born, he used to tell me, I was born into wealth. I didn't choose this life. He was such a good guy. So I was the one who convinced him to move away from pivot from Bitcoin and to look into other altcoins that were developing and introduced him to Chris Larsen and Ripple. I mean, you can literally go and ask the early founders of Ripple, Arthur Brito, or Chris. They'll tell you, I made that introduction to a point where, Chris and I, he still gives me the time of day if I message him. Right. I left that kind of footprint with them. And Matthew then ended up helping them expand globally. That was in 2014. And here's another really interesting story. After I made the introduction, and here's how I will tell you such a detail that no one would know. Only Chris and Matthew would know this. After Matthew flew out to San Francisco from New York to meet Chris, Chris called me and he's like, thanks for that. Actually, I was supposed to meet Matthew a number of years ago because we have a mutual friend who's the president of Sony USA. And that president's kids were actually going to the same private school as Chris Larsen's.
Mm.
So they were supposed to meet a number of years ago. It never worked out. And so, they talked about that when they met. So they met, and then Matthew called me and he said, after he met him, and he goes, David, they're about to close their Series A. I want to invest. I told Chris I wanted to put money in, but Chris is telling me that it's going to be really tight because it's pretty much closed now, Series A. And he said, do you mind reaching out to Chris for me and maybe having a chat with him? So I literally sent Chris an email and I said, hey, Chris, look, I think it would be fantastic to take even a small amount of money from Matthew and have his profile working with Ripple.
Mm.
Given what we just discussed about now you pivoting to go after Swift, right? So cut to the chase, what happened was Chris actually sold him a part of his equity at the same valuation to get Matthew in.
Mm. What happened to Ripple afterwards? And I'm asking that because I've been in crypto since 2017. So what is that? 6-7 years. So much less long than you, right? But since I'm in there, there was this kind of crazy pump of XRP in 2017 bull run. But the narrative of what's going on there is, at least on the very crypto side of people, right? It's more like a coin that newcomers who don't understand anything kind of buy, and they join this kind of culture, but there's not much going on behind it, right? A bit like Cardano. It's kind of like this cult where there's supposedly some things in Africa happening, but no one really believes it, at least in the crypto side. But on the kind of normal people side, there's a lot of people who follow that, right?
I would say actually Ripple is doing a lot. It's just, it's doing it in a part of the industry that native crypto guys don't really care about, right? Which is the banks and working with regulators and right. So they're not paying much attention, so they're not going to really know what's going on. But most of the banks, like I can tell you right now, Standard Chartered Bank, and I know this from people who are there, they're quietly implementing Ripple. It will be a payment option, not as a token to sell or buy, but in terms of Ripple Net and the network, and using that as an alternative for settling payments, right, for cross-border payments. So there is a lot of work. I think the thing is, it's been pretty quiet over the last few years because of the SEC challenges that they've had and the lawsuit.
Yeah.
So all this work that they had done leading up to banks investing and banks creating POCs for them, they couldn't make a lot of noise around that because the banks, they knew the risk of the legal. If they had, if the legal case goes one way, that's great. If it goes the other way and the banks are pushing this, it's not going to look good.
So there is a lot of stuff being built with the Ripple infrastructure.
Correct.
Which is not the case on the Cardano one, right? And the reason I'm asking that is not to criticize anything, it's more to try to pick your mind, because you've been in crypto for 12 years, right? Why are newcomers always gravitating towards projects with pretty much nothing happening? And Cardano is kind of like a really big example, right?
I think human beings, the average person gravitates towards personalities. And let's face it, the whole crypto industry is like a cult of personalities, right? I wouldn't, engineering wise, there are some very smart people engineering wise. They're not financially the smartest people. They're not politically the smartest people, or at least I would argue, right? Based on, things that they may do or say or decisions that they may make. But Cardano is one of those where, I'm not sure if Charles Hoskin's I'm not sure what the reason was for him to develop it. And if I asked the average crypto person, I'm not sure they would know. So the strategy or the ideology of Cardano is very neither here nor there. And I think when you don't have an identity as a project, it becomes difficult to really hang your hat on something, you know? And I spent time with the Tezos Foundation. Like I set up TZ APAC here in Asia.
We had Arthur Brightman on the podcast.
Yeah, did you? Great.
We had him. A very interesting experience.
Yeah, smart guy, but you know, my challenge working there was I'm not sure it was the most open organization for trying different ideas because they were so technically focused. And that's why the product is actually very high quality in terms of what they develop. I'm still a fan of their tech, even though people will argue with me like, you know, who the fuck knows Mickelson smart contract language? Like, who's going to use OCaml except for the academics? But the theory behind why he did it this way makes sense, right? It's just, I think, taking that product and trying to have trusted people who understand commercial opportunities with that product and enabling them to do what they do best is probably where I was challenged there.
I mean, obviously, like any kind of startup of product, like you can have the best tech if you're not good in business or in marketing, it's gonna be complicated to be successful, right? I mean, if not impossible.
I remember I'm working at Morgan Stanley in Tokyo, and my boss at the time, his name was Sean. He said to me, like, it was my first week starting, and he goes, "Look, let me give you the lay of the land on the floor, just so you know who's who in the zoo." So okay. He goes, "You see those guys in the corner?" I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "Those guys are the smartest fucking guys on the whole floor." I'm like, "Okay, so they do the structuring?" He's like, "They do the structuring and the execution of it. Super fucking smart." I'm like, "Okay, great. So maybe I should go talk to him." He goes, No. I said, "Why not?" He goes, "Because they won't talk to you." I'm like, "Why not?" He goes, "Because nobody fucking likes him." Like, he's an American guy. He was living in Tokyo for 20 years. He's like, "Nobody fucking likes him." I'm like, "Sean, what's the point of, like, okay, what do you tell me here? Like, avoid them, go meet them?" I'm not sure. I'm a bit confused my first week here. He's like, "My point is, Dave, the smartest people in the fucking room, nobody likes them. So they're actually useless." And I was like, "What?" And then I thought about it that night, and it made 100% sense. It's kind of like having a database, like full of very rich data, super functional, super fast, but if it's not plugged into a network, it's actually useless.
One of the things that's really interesting with you is you're an early Bitcoiner, right? And usually early Bitcoiners, they have pretty strong views on Bitcoin and how the ecosystem evolved and the technology. And often, I mean, I would say now they're kind of forced to open their mind, but for a lot of them, it took a lot of time.
Yeah.
Whereas for you were fairly quickly, you know, oh, Ripple, oh, probably Ethereum, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
One of the things that you spend a lot of time on right now is gaming.
Yeah.
So much so, you think it makes so much sense that you actually join Immutable X?
Correct. Yep.
As a, is it head of business development or correct?
Head of business development for Asia and EMEA. Yeah.
How big is gaming in the Web2 world?
Massive. Like, we're talking close to 100 billion. Like, I would say over 50 billion. I don't know the exact number. It's definitely over 50 billion. The market is huge. And it's only getting bigger because I think these game developers or these game companies, especially the AAA larger ones, the games are now becoming IP, and the IP is then extending into omnichannels for distribution, right? So what was once a game like Assassin's Creed and developing revenue off the back of the game, now you extend that revenue because you're pushing it through to Netflix as a movie.
Mm-hmm.
Or it then can be turned into a comic book, right? So there are these different omni-channels that are being created with these video games because the games are becoming IP. And so that, to me, that's where Web3 becomes really interesting, because that IP can get uniquely validated and identified on a chain. And also you can create now another omni-channel distribution through, collectibles or integration of NFTs as an asset class into your game. And so there's many ways to now split the hair and create more revenue streams.
You went as far as saying that gaming is the future of Web3.
Yep.
How would you explain that to your mother?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, it's almost as simple as people are more and more on their phones. People are more and more on the internet. Like, when you think of your own daily schedule, like, how much time do you actually spend on your phone, on the internet? Like, whether it's in your laptop, your desktop, or on your phone or your iPad, you're on the internet constantly.
Mm.
And so what's happening is we're training ourselves to be a lot more digital in how we operate. And at this moment in time, we're still very two-dimensional in how we operate on the internet, whether it's sending funds or whether it's buying product on e-commerce, or whether it's using apps. Like, if you use an exercise app, it's very two-dimensional. I think at some point, we're going to see the interaction between applications and human beings evolve. How that looks right now, I'm not sure, but I can take a guess. And I would imagine that it's going to be more like a Ready Player One environment, where we're so submersed into a particular app that impacts our day-to-day life, right? What I would say is, looking at your emails, for instance, this is a good example. We started out looking at emails as a part of our communication before we had these chat applications, right? How you interacted with your computer or your mobile at the time, looking at emails and sending emails, is very different than your behavior, which is a lot more immersive on WhatsApp or Telegram. So you got to wonder, that can't be the end game. There's got to be another. What is that? Who knows? Potentially it could be you as an avatar having an avatar to avatar conversation through voice recognition rather than using your thumbs and tapping on your phone. Like, I don't know, I'm guessing, but I'm just saying, I think there's a trajectory here, and we're not done at WhatsApp. So if you think of it that way, of course I can explain to my mother, hey, Mom, you know what it's like sending emails? Yeah, I do. Well, you don't send as much anymore because you send me messages, right, on WhatsApp? Yeah. What do you think the difference is there in terms of your behavior? Well, I'm feeling like I'm interacting with a live person more because you respond. But sometimes it's not, because you don't respond till like 15 minutes later or, half a day later. And I said, yeah, and what if those air gaps, what I call pockets of, or air pockets, get filled to keep you believing that you're talking to me till I'm actually there? Because there's an avatar that represents, through AI, the way that I might answer that question. Because it's been mimicking me or listening to me for how I've been, behave, like my behavior in chats, to be able to do that. So again, big guess.
And you think gaming helps get there?
Gaming helps get there because gaming is one of the most immersive ways of interacting with the digital at this stage. Besides VR, but that's still very outlier, right? I'm talking in terms of like standard day-to-day stuff. Gaming is the closest thing for the most immersive digital interaction you'll have.
So you're bullish gaming in Web3, but there is a bunch of companies that you could have joined. Yet you choose to join Immutable X. Why?
I joined Immutable because I'm really aligned with the founders and how they see the market. Number one, I think that Immutable has the right tech. I think they have the right business model. And they have the right people. It's a very, very good group. Like, the people team at Immutable, the HR team, have done a phenomenal job of hiring. And And so, I think if anyone's going to lead gaming, it's going to be Immutable. And the other reason is because that's all they do, right? Like they don't do DeFi. They don't look at things like SocialFi. They only look at gaming. And we have our own studios, so we built our own games and have seen quite a bit of success with the games, like Gods Unchained. So it's the closest thing to a real Web3 game company in a sense that they build their own games as well, and all they do is games.
There's a few other areas in crypto that you're bullish on besides gaming. One is real world assets in DeFi.
Yeah.
Why? And what's an example of maybe a team that you think is doing a really good job or a promising job at that?
Yeah, Cicada is a team out in. If Christine's listening, hey Christine, they're based out in California, and they have built a RWA product or platform on Maple Finance. So I'm pretty bullish on what they're doing. Look, my view of RWA is that, especially now with the Bitcoin ETF being approved, I think institutional interest is only going to grow. The next natural thing for institutions in terms of evolving their interest from here to the next step is going to be about tokenizing other assets.
Even Larry Fink was the other day on the TV already talking about that, essentially.
Yeah.
Saying we're going to tokenize everything, every financial assets, which were making people very excited about an ETH, ETF. And
So that's why I'm bullish. I think it's mainly because of the legitimate institutional interest that's coming, which will follow with institutional money. And I think their focus area will be on real world assets, whether it's real estate, whether it's gold, tokenizing gold, whether it's, there's a lot of costs with wrapping contracts around and creating ETFs around gold, right? I think it's actually going to be a lot more efficient taking commodities and tokenizing them than the current state of how they're being traded, which is through ETFs or futures, right? So RWA to me is going to be a big thing going forward.
And you think Maple Finance has a key role?
I think I like Maple Finance. I like what they built. I like what they do. They have projects that are that they've partnered with, like I said, Cicada in California. Their RWA is really about tokenization of credit and financial products that exist today, essentially extracting the current yield that is generated from real world assets and bringing that yield back into DeFi and crypto, because DeFi yields have not been where they were from a few years ago, right? So that shows a lot of utility value with tokenization, with all the machines that run DeFi. And I think the market will like that as long as regulation allows it to happen, because it's really about taking the technology and creating utility value for this stuff, right?
You are a big fan of Africa?
Huge fan of Africa.
Both as a market for Web3, but also in terms of what it means geopolitically regarding the shift from west to east. So we don't have a lot of time, but this is really something I want to explore, both these topics of, your opinion on the shifting global power from west to east and how Africa plays a role in that.
Yeah. Very simply, I have for a number of years, because of my banking background, I really pay attention to a lot of macroeconomic signals. I follow politics globally. Like I look out for a lot of these types of global indicators. What I've started to realize is that there was several years ago, and there's a whole chapter in my book that talks about this. I started seeing a trend of people countries de-dollarizing. It started with, Iran, and then, Russia, and then eventually even the EU choosing to de-dollarize to buy Iranian oil directly. So if you Google Iranian embargo and EU purchasing, Europe purchasing Iranian oil, you'll see that there should be a number of articles talking about how the EU didn't feel that the US sanctions was fair in terms of Iranian oil. And so because the US sanctioned them, no one can buy their oil because oil settles in US dollar in the open market, which means that you have to go through SWIFT. And if the US is like, you're sanctioned, you can't go through SWIFT. So what the European Union did was create a separate entity to deal directly with the Iranians to buy their oil. This is not something I'm making up. It's news. It happened. So that, I was still in banking when that happened. I think it was 2016 or 17. And I remember thinking, wow, this is fucking huge. This is a turning point in history.
For people maybe to understand, because there's a key kind of like message that I'd like to get to here. Can you explain how the BRICS countries started, how it evolved, and how these countries' dependence on the dollar, US dollar, changed over time? Because essentially you think the dollar is over, right?
My bet is that the dollar is going to sink. Well, when I mean sink, I mean it's not going to be the global intermediary currency for settling trades anymore. So yeah, BRICS started out with Goldman Sachs. It was an idea by one of their research analysts or research people. They wrote a research paper about BRICS and how these were, BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and how these countries are countries to watch out for in terms of emerging markets. That's how it started. It goes from that to actually the countries going, you know what, that's a great idea, and forming a formal sort of a membership where they all came together. And then they've just recently started adding more members to this body. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Ethiopia. And so what I think BRICS is doing is they are realizing, I mean, Russia is a part of BRICS, right? Let me just reemphasize that. What they're doing is they're looking to create a separate alternative to be able to trade with each other without having to go through SWIFT and the US dollar.
What does this concretely mean? Like, what's the consequence of that for the US?
What this means is what I believe, and people can dig into this, I believe that the alternative that they're creating will be a blockchain-based digital currency. Whether it's a CBDC or a stablecoin, it's all going to run through blockchain-based settlement rails. And what this is going to mean is, if you think about it, the US, the only way they can thrive, and this is why, in my view, it's a country that actually needs wars for their economies to grow, for their economy to grow. And therefore, my view is like some of these proxy wars in the Middle East or in Ukraine, and potentially down the line with Taiwan, is not something that the Americans would be heavily opposed against, because it would enable them to then go justify printing more US dollars.
So basically, that was my question. The US dollar, I mean, the US needs wars to have an excuse to print more dollars.
What is going to rile up the Americans more than a war of, reinforcing patriotism, and also keeping them a little bit sort of disillusioned so that they can go and pass bills and have money being printed. Most recently, in the fourth quarter of last year, Joe Biden is passed a bill for $100 billion to fund Ukraine, Israel, and Indochina, which means Taiwan.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not making this shit up. People can go look at it. $100 billion on top of, every trillion that they printed before. Like, this is how the system works for them. But what they didn't anticipate was that the whole world would get off the US dollar, because if they do, the demand for the dollar sinks. Think about it. Yet they have to push supply up. That's not going to work well.
Which is, I mean, understanding this is extremely important, because that's one of the reasons why Bitcoin exists. If you read the Bitcoin Standard by Saif Dinamus, it's just explaining what's been happening since hundreds of thousands of years, right? Which is governments, not only the US, printing more money to fund wars and economic crisis over and over again,
Yeah.
right? And why, I mean, what's the sound money, what's not the sound money, etc., right?
Yep.
So concretely, what's the time frame? The dollar is over. What's your time frame? And I'm going to think very selfishly, but because we are all, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we talked about being selfish versus thinking about the greater good, right? But
Yeah.
everybody's like, fuck, man, what does that mean for my investments? Should I invest in US denominated assets, S&P 500, NASDAQ? If I invest in stocks, which a lot of us don't do much because we like Bitcoin and crypto.
Yeah.
What's the time frame, and how should people maybe switch their personal investments? Obviously, we're not doing investment advices, but like, do I store my cash in dollars or something else?
Yeah. I'm not sure, what this means for people's portfolio, but what I would say is people in general should, now that they know, they should keep an eye out on how this evolves.
Mm-hmm.
Timeline wise, if I'm a betting man in Vegas, I think a lot of this will accelerate once and if and once China decides to go after Taiwan.
Why?
Because if China decides to go after Taiwan, which if you were to ask me, I think they will sometime in between now and 2027. If they do, and when I say go after, there's different ways of going after, right? Like you can go and physically start a war, or you can start by sanctioning Taiwan and then creating a layer of cyber war, sending drones, right? It doesn't have to be face-to-face combat or military jets flying over and bombing people. Like, let me be very clear. So when that happens, I think it's going to trigger the West and their allies sanctioning China. But I think China's ready for it because they've already had a dry run. If you remember COVID, they had an extended period of COVID lockdown, and people were scratching their head going, why are they the only ones that are extending this? And not only that, if you paid attention closely, they were drilling Shanghai. Everyone in Shanghai who lived there, they tell you like, holy shit, my parents can't even get their medication. And they were making a case out of Shanghai in the news. Why not any other major city, right? Like, why not Shenzhen? The reason why is because Shanghai is the most internationally exposed city in China that the Chinese government doesn't have full control over. In a sense that people are free thinking. Like, if you've been to Shanghai, it doesn't feel like it, any other city, quite frankly.
I was there 10 years ago.
Exactly.
Been some time.
So they put it on Shanghai to make sure that they knew what it was going to feel like if they're going to get sanctioned. It was a dry run, and they're ready for it. And if they get sanctioned and they need to pull off the US dollar because they can't use SWIFT anymore, they've tested and piloted the e-renminbi already. And they've already started discussing at BRICS direct swaps to settle stuff. They're prepared. The Chinese, I always say to people like, and it's not because I'm pro-China, it's just I'm pro-intelligent people, right? Like the US may play chess, the Chinese are playing Go, right? Thousands of permutations. So they think way far ahead. And so if they hit Taiwan, and China gets sanctioned, you're going to start seeing that first domino where a real second largest power in the world starts getting off the US dollar. And then that'll create a domino effect with everyone else who trades with them.
Maybe as an end to this podcast, which could be a good introduction for our next podcast together. Can you tell us, obviously it could be and probably will be a podcast on its own. But what's attracting you so much in Africa? What's the opportunity there?
Everything I just told you, if it all happens, the biggest benefactor will be the continent of Africa. And the reason for that is because Africa is the most geopolitically neutral continent. India is exposed to the West and the East. Obviously, China, Russia, Europe, the US, like you're taking one, even Singapore, you have to take one side or the other. Africa hasn't really taken one side or the other. You can argue that the Chinese are there building bridges, but that's not meaning that they're politically aligned to them. They're taking their money to build these bridges, which is quite different than politically siding with them on various different stances, so to speak. They're clearly not in the direction of Europe or the US. So they're one of the freest, politically, they're one of the freest. In addition to that, they have over 30% of the world's resources, 60% of the world's arable land. And I think as we start getting into more inclusive behavior from countries and away from globalization, there will be a lot more challenges with not just supply chain, but things like food or things like minerals and other kinds of resources. And Africa is ultimately where a lot of these countries will come. It'll be the marketplace for the world.
Are they so is Africa politically more neutral because people don't care about them yet? Because they're less developed, and it's only when you're more developed that you have a bigger sort of like say, or people want you on their side?
I think they're more politically neutral because they represent themselves as a union, just like Europe. So, I mean, you're from Europe, right? Like, if Germany had an opinion about China, the EU would say that's Germany's opinion. That's not the EU's opinion. The African Union is also similar, right? 52 or 54 countries. I think if Nigeria had a view, right, and they decided to join BRICS, the African Union itself might have a different view because they're representing a union just like Europe. And I think this is what enables them to be a little bit more arm's length in having to side with different positions, but also historically, no one really gave a rat's ass about Africa to a point where they wanted their political, where they wanted their political sort of votes, right? Globally.
What's the takeaway from today's podcast?
I think the takeaway is that, crypto and blockchain and Web3 is more than just a cool piece of technology. It is actually becoming, it is actually at the forefront of changing, the way that countries will trade, the way that countries will operate in terms of settling trades, continents democratizing their resources through this. I think it's also dangerous in a sense that all of that, as it goes online, gives more power back to the government because things become so traceable. So it is a double-edged sword.
Thank you so much for doing this, man.
A lot of fun.
That was awesome.
Fastest hour and a half of my life.